Hey guys, I'm about to bleed the clutch on the C5 and I thought you might want to hang out and check it out. So let's get started. The first thing I like to do is actually from inside the car. I like to pump the clutch about 20 or 30 times, and what that does is kind of stirs up anything inside the slave cylinder, any sort of debris like clutch dust or whatever else, and kind of get it in suspension in the fluid so that when I bleed it, I'm successful at getting the fluid cleaned out. Step 2 really is to locate the master cylinder for the clutch. We're going to remove the cap so that we can get a look at the fluid and see just how dirty it is. You can never be too careful. I like enough blankets and towels around so that I don't get the brake fluid on anything. Mine's fairly dirty. It's got about 1 year on it since I changed the clutch, the pressure plate, the flywheel, and the slave cylinder. So I'm going to go ahead and suck out the old fluid, clean out the reservoir, then we'll go ahead and replace it with new .4 fluid. To remove the old fluid, I like to use a Mighty Vac with a little suction needle. And it's important though, whatever you're going to stick inside the reservoir, you got to make sure there's absolutely zero oil or contaminants or anything on this part. So now I'm going to insert it in the reservoir, and with the Mighty Vac, we'll go ahead and suction up all of the fluid out of the reservoir. Make sure you dispose of the old fluid in a ecologically sound way. Next, using a clean paper towel, I'm just going to go ahead and clean the reservoir because sometimes there's little brown specks that are either clutch dust or they're kind of brown from the rubber expansion thingamabob that goes just underneath the cap. This is the thingamabob I'm talking about. It's the rubber expansion seal that goes underneath the cap. For fluid, I like to use Prestone .4 fluid. I believe the .4 has a higher boiling point than .3, so I've had really good luck with it. If you have headers and you do a lot of road racing, creating tons of heat underneath the car and next to the transmission, you might want to explore. There are some better fluids than this, but this has worked just fine for me. Next up, we're going to go ahead and fill the reservoir up to pretty close to the top. I've got my thumb over the top, nice and clean with lacquer thinner actually, so I don't contaminate the fluid. And just fill her up to pretty close to the top. And that'll allow us, as we're bleeding it, to use the fluid that's in the reservoir. Now my clutch has a remote bleeder that I installed when I did the clutch a year ago. This hose goes down to the bleeder that's on the slave cylinder and allows me to bleed it from up top. If yours still has the stock location bleeder, we'll talk about that at the end as to how you're going to get to that. So moving on, I'm going to go ahead and I'll have an assistant do the pressing of the clutch and the releasing on my command while I go ahead and bleed the old fluid and any air out while it's replaced with the new fluid. Down. Up. Down. Up. Pump it a couple times. Up. Down. Up. Pump it a couple times. Down. Up.
Oh, that's good.
Is it up right now?
Yeah.
Down. Up. Pump it a couple times. Down. Up. Okay, we're done bleeding, so now I'm going to fill the reservoir back up about halfway. Then go ahead and reinstall the cap with the expansion rubber. Snug it up tight, but not super tight. Doesn't take a whole lot. And here's what my fluid looked like after a few rounds of pumping until it came out clear. You can see there's some debris in there, but not too bad. If you don't have a remote bleeder, there's two ways that I'm aware of to successfully bleed the stock C5 slave cylinder. Neither one is really easy. From underneath, you can do it by removing the H-pipe and the tunnel plate. Then you reach up along the driver's side of where the torque tube bolts to the bell housing. And just about near the top, you'll start to feel the clutch line that goes to the master cylinder. And then a little bit further up top is where the bleeder bolt comes out of the torque tube housing. And I believe it's around a 7/16 wrench, and that's where you would tighten and loosen as you're having an assistant operate the pedal to bleed the clutch fluid. It would just drain out through the bottom of the bell housing, and then you're good to go. It's not easy. The other method that I'm aware of is you take off the intake manifold, and if you lay up on the top of the engine, you can reach with your hand, and apparently you can get down there and access that bleeder bolt. So those are the two ways to bleed the clutch if you have just the stock slave setup. Someone is sure to ask about it, so I'm going to talk briefly about the Ranger method, which is basically just sucking the fluid out of the reservoir, replacing it, and pumping the pedal about 100 times. The fluid gets a little dirty, you replace it again, and maybe you repeat this process a few times. Problem is, you're not bleeding the slave cylinder. You're not getting any gunk that's accumulated in the slave cylinder out, and it's easy to do, so if you're having an issue and you want to try it, more power to you, but in my experience and from the research I've done, it's not a replacement for bleeding the clutch slave cylinder. Hey guys, thanks for watching the video. As always, if you liked the video, hit the thumbs up and remember to subscribe.